Hi, I'm Imogen Blood, and in this episode of Change Talk, I'm joined by Penelope Green. Penelope is head of influencing and evaluation at Look Ahead, a supported housing provider that's worked locally with the NHS and with local authorities to develop a range of community-based housing and support models for people with mental health conditions. We talk in this podcast about how Look Ahead has managed to persuade the NHS to invest and the role that these projects can play within a neighbourhood health model. I was particularly keen to speak to Penelope because before joining Look Ahead, she'd spent 18 years in the civil service and she'd held senior roles at both the Department of Health and Social Care and at the Cabinet Office. We reflect together on what the asks are of central government and why it seems to be so hard for government to act and invest in order to scale up this type of development, even when it visibly leads to better outcomes for individuals and cost savings for health and other services. Penelope gives us a clear vision and lots of real world examples of just what's possible when housing is part of the place based strategic conversation. There are insights here for other housing providers too about influencing at both local and national levels to make this happen. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as we did. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Penelope Green, who is the head of evaluation and influencing at Look Ahead. Hi, Penelope. Welcome to Change Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming along. So, yeah, just starting off with your job title actually makes me think that it would be really helpful to begin with a little bit of an overview for our listeners of what Look Ahead actually does.
I can definitely do that. So, yes, I work for Look Ahead, which is a specialist housing provider. So, we're a registered provider, a charitable landlord. We provide a range of supported housing services. So, supported housing covers quite a vast breadth of services and supports a vast array of customers. Ours is mainly in four customer groups. It's a crude sort of divvying up, but mainly homelessness, which is where we started 50 years ago, mental health, which has been sort of the area where we've had the most growth recently, children and young people, and then learning disability and autism services. So it's quite a range. We're sort of a medium-sized, small to medium-sized provider. So we support about 3,000 people across about 1,800 units, and we have about 900 staff, most of whom are out in our services supporting people. So that's Look Ahead. And the reason I wanted to work for Look Ahead in particular was they are so active in the NHS integration space. Which, given my background in DHSC, which I'm sure we'll come to, the Department for Health and Social Care, I was really interested in going to a provider which was doing the integration that we talk so often about. And certainly the area of growth recently for Look Ahead has been on the NHS side with mental health services.
Brilliant. And just tell us a little bit more about some of the integration that Look Ahead's been working on. Given to me, I don't know if you want to give us an example of a scheme or initiative.
Yep, I can do that.
Yeah.
So I think probably the most high profile one recently has been our Barnsley Street project, which is what we call it, is one of the national pilots that the NHS is doing of a neighbourhood health service. So a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week neighbourhood health service. So that's out in Tower Hamlets, and it is working with ELFT, the East London Foundation Trust. They provide clinical support, and then our input is the building. Being a housing provider, but we also provide our support workers, and they work in a team with the clinicians from ELFT, but also with community providers, so third sector, sort of social prescribing, that sort of community input. And it's fab. I spent a day there over August, and it is, as you'd imagine, 24/7. It is open to the public. Anyone can walk in and receive support. It's a lovely building. It's calm, lots of plants. There's a pool table. And people mill around, and the staff have a big table in the kitchen, and it's a welcoming place for people to come if they're having challenges with their mental health. And it just feels so different to perhaps the institutional feel, which absolutely has its place in hospital, but very much this is a community service to support people with a variety of challenges. So whether that is clinical support, which they can get from psychiatrists on site, or it's some of our skilled professional support staff who can help them with perhaps benefits issues, or if they just want to sit down and have a cup of tea if they're having a bad day, is a much more holistic approach to support. And I just think that stuff is fab, and it's really thinking about not only how do we support the NHS and the system to manage its time better and make sure that those clinicians and secure sort of hospital placements are there for people who really need to be in hospital, but also it's best for people. It's better for people to be out nearer their home. They're free to come and go as they please. There's a bed to stay if they would like to and they need to, and home isn't safe for them or isn't where they want to be at the moment. You know, it's such a great community offering. So
that's just such an amazing vision of kind of prevention at that community level. We'll come back a bit later on to sort of talk about some of the opportunities around neighbourhood health. But I'm really sort of really struck by that kind of joint working with health, and I'm wondering from a sort of funding perspective, because of course that's the big issue, isn't it, in the housing support sector? Well, indeed in every sector, but you know, we're featuring in some of our other podcasts, you know, me talking to various kind of supported housing providers about just how difficult it is at the moment to get the kind of support element of their models commissioned. And I'm just wondering, I mean, Look Ahead has had probably more success than anyone else, or is certainly one of the most successful providers, I think, at managing to kind of get health not only to be part of that delivery model, but also to actually directly fund some of your schemes. I'm just wondering what that's taken really in terms of influencing, evidence, partnerships, general sort of presence. Really, how have you managed to achieve that? What's been your secret, do you think?
So I think it's sort of all of the above what you've spoken about. I think there's part of my role actually is about evaluating and evidence of our services. So I think it is about forming a relationship and a partnership. So a lot of our services that have grown up in the last sort of couple of years are through the East London Foundation Trust, where we are quite close with them as a provider, and one of those services, for example, is a discharge support service. So that came up from a conversation. It is sharing information, and it is trying to see as a provider, how can we help meet the challenges that the NHS is facing. So at the time, one of its hospital sites in Newham had quite high rate of clinically ready for discharge. So people who don't need to be in hospital clinically, they're ready for discharge, but they're still in hospital because there's a myriad of reasons why you would still be in hospital, but they either don't have somewhere to go, or they're waiting for the home to be ready, care package to be ready. They were spending a lot of money because their hospital beds were full. They were spending a lot of money with private providers. This is not a sort of statement on private providers, but obviously that is an expensive way of providing hospital capacity. And they were also spending, so they're spending about £370,000 per month on private providers, private beds, often out of area. So it's not good for people to be out of area, away from their support network. And the Trust was also spending several £1,000s per month on B&Bs, so travel lodge. Nothing against travel lodge, but again, if you're leaving hospital, that's not really where you want to be. So with that challenge, they came to us with that challenge, and we developed with them. We had a building called Ibis House, which is out in Newham, so in their catchment for this area. And it was ideal for a discharge step-down support service, is what we would call it. So we've got 10 beds in there, which is a step-down service. So that means that for people who are ready to leave hospital, but for whatever reason, often they're either homeless and they're waiting for the local authority to support them with somewhere more permanent, or they've got a home, support families home, but for whatever reason, the family isn't ready for them to come home. They need to be clean, their fridge doesn't work. There's all manner of very practical things which stop people going home. And instead of staying in hospital at the cost of, say, £400 a night, they can come to us. So rather conveniently, the numbers worked out that we can talk about the outcomes, which is absolutely what it's all about, but the money is compelling, that for the cost of our service, for those 10 beds for the year, that was the same cost that they were spending on private beds for a month.
Wow.
And within 6 months of our service being in place, they'd reduced their private bed spend and their B&B spend to zero. And it's just the scale of those services, those savings, and the speed with which they came on stream. You very rarely get in-year cashable savings. And you could argue that obviously somebody else is going to come through the door, so it's not like they've got a spare capacity and everything's you're able to sort of close down a ward or something. It's not that, but if you're saving that level of money, that's millions of pounds per year, and that is replicable. There's so many trusts which have that same challenge, and that partnership working, we're able to bring, as a provider, we're able to bring buildings, we bring housing expertise, we bring skilled support staff we're very clear that we don't have a clinical infrastructure ourselves. So these are not trained clinicians, but they're skilled workers who know how to support someone with mental health need. And the support that they provide to people, I've been to interview customers of ours who are staying at Ibis, and they just say it is transformational for them. They didn't feel ready to go home, very anxious about going home and being on their own. And the staff, knowing that they're there, they can come and go as they please. They've got their own front door.
Yeah.
But if they're having a bad day, if they need support with their medication, if they need help to try and navigate sort of further homelessness support from the local authority, they're not on their own in a travel lodge room trying to do it on their own. They've got support to do it. And I just think that, if we can be more robust about evidencing some of this, which is what I'm working on now, that is both good from Look Ahead's perspective, locally, to be able to demonstrate the impact of our services, but also I've always got an eye to the bigger picture and that national shortage of information and evidence about what supported housing can do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, really interesting. And those two examples you've given are just speak, to I suppose two parts of the system where we know there are just huge challenges. I mean, we know there are lots of people reaching, almost like having to reach mental health crisis in the community before they can access kind of the clinical support you need, because mental health services are so overstretched, and people are then kind of almost forced to lose whatever current housing they've got in order to get into hospital. So you're the first scheme you described is providing that kind of, opportunity for prevention, for kind of to access that kind of crisis and kind of preventative support in your local community. And then, of course, we know that once people get into those psychiatric mental health inpatient settings, it's often really difficult to kind of get out, isn't it, for the reasons you've described. And yet you're providing again this kind of step down back into the community. And I mean, obviously we hear all the time that there just isn't enough money in these systems to kind of do that kind of strategic planning, to kind of provide the kind of long-term security that housing providers like yourselves need in order to make these capital investments. But as you know, I was involved in doing some, I suppose, research last year for the Greater London Authority, looking at mental health supported housing across London. And it was really shocking, actually, just how much kind of very sort of non-strategic, reactive, one-off spot purchasing of often eye-wateringly expensive placements is going on within that system. And if you compare that with this very sort of partnership-based, let's come up with some joint solutions and make them happen in a local place, it's frustrating, isn't it, that isn't just happening everywhere,
And it can work, and I think that's the frustration. So I think from sitting in a national policy making position, there is no, as far as I'm aware, there is no regulatory, legal, structural barrier to doing this stuff well, to investing in supported housing as a place, because it is beneficial for all parties, not least the people who are being served. However, it is hard because we have set up a complex system. We can get into some of those complexities, perhaps, but that's not to say that it's not possible. And I just think what we see across public policy, you see pockets of best practice and pockets of absolutely inspiring practice, but how do you scale those? And I think that's how I started with Look Ahead, was through a challenge from the Waits Family Enterprise Trust, who support my role, and they had supported the setup of a particular service, again, a mental health service, crisis for young people in crisis, mental health crisis. So quite a specialist service for people to prevent them having to go into hospital. And these are young people who, yes, otherwise would be in an institution. But the challenge from the Waits Family Enterprise Trust, which is a philanthropic funding, was, this is great, and that's 12 beds that we've provided for this specific cohort, but the demand is so much more than that. So how do you scale that approach? And so what I was looking at there on the capital funding side was, you can't scale supported housing without the housing. So how do you fund the housing, and what funding sources are available? And you've been involved in that work and that world, and the money is there and it is possible. And that report that I researched came up with some amazing examples that I was able to bring to light in the report. But why don't we see that widespread? And I think there's a combination of factors, and it's partly sort of relationships and partnership working that I've spoken about. That takes time to build. It takes time and headspace for busy public servants in particular, but every organisation feels busy. But carving out that time to think beyond the absolute sort of burning platform is important, and to take a longer term view and to be more strategic. But also there's a sort of risk appetite from boards. Within Look Ahead, we have stock, we have property, and we're able to raise grant funding and public funding, which is great, and that's a real strength. But it's still challenging for us to bring our board with us sometimes, because of the revenue funding. That's a whole question in itself, but the revenue funding to pay for the care and support, as opposed to the funding that pays for the building, it's really hard. So particularly on the local authority side, we're all very aware of how challenging it is within a local authority, and lots of local authorities aren't even able to meet their statutory responsibilities, which it's really challenging. And in that context, the number of contracts that we're able to make work from our perspective, because as a provider we have standards that obviously we wish to meet in terms of the quality of the accommodation we're providing and the support we're providing, so the staffing. And if we can't make that add up for a local authority tender, then why would we invest in a building? Why would we invest in a service if we're not sure it's going to meet its costs? It's not even about it being profitable, it's about it meeting its costs. So I think that's a real challenge. And that's why ideally we would be able to make that argument to government about the importance of revenue funding and the importance of the sector. And so it all comes back to sort of what is our evidence base, and how do we demonstrate the widespread impact of these services, not only to local authorities, but to the NHS, to the justice system. It is widespread, and how do we make that case and build that case?
Absolutely. And I mean, I know that your role, is quite broad in terms of a degree of, I don't know if I'd describe it as lobbying, but certainly kind of making yourself, known and heard within, spaces such as, I believe you're going to the Labour Party conference in the future. And obviously I attended one of the events that you put on in the House of Commons. So, that you're obviously not just working at that kind of place-based level to try and government influence change, but also really trying to look at that kind of national question of scale. And I'm just wondering, what kind of change do you hope to influence through that? What are your asks? What do you hope will come about through that work?
So I think the main thing for me is the profile and understanding of supported housing, and having worked in government, I've had supported housing as part of my job. But to be completely honest, the breadth, the complexity, the value of it, I only really got it when I was able to volunteer routinely in a supported housing service. That's why I decided to leave government, and why I wanted to work for a provider in particular, was to increase my understanding and learn how to actually deliver these services. And I think the profile of supported housing, sadly, it is not well understood broadly across government. Obviously, the supported housing team and MHCLG know their stuff, and I would never deny that. And there's some really engaged public servants, but it's hard because the profile of it is low. When push comes to shove, particularly in DHSC, operational standards for the NHS will always eclipse social care, will always eclipse supported housing, because people waiting in A&E for hours, being treated in corridors, delayed discharges, all that stuff, which really matters, and it really matters to people. I'm not decrying that. It's just really frustrating that those challenges can be improved massively if you're able to take a longer term view and invest in social care, supported housing, those less visible sides of services in the community that support people who need support for whatever reason, but they're less visible. So I think the profile of that is really important, and getting ministers, getting senior officials out to actually spend some time in these services. Let's get them to Barnsley Street. What an amazing place to go and spend time in. But any of our services, I just think the understanding you get from being in them is not like anything else. You can't get that from sitting behind a desk. And I've spent many years sat behind a desk. So I think, profile and understanding the role of the sector is really important. Then how we work to understand that across government is also really important. So what as I said, the investment will probably be through MHCLG, through local authority budgets, through the capital funding, but the benefits accrue so much broader across government. So how do you account for that in government? So that's absolutely beyond my pay grade, and always has been. But thinking about how we do fiscal events in government, how it's a zero-sum game effectively. So if there's 100 million to get, every department wants that for itself, because that's the way the event is set up. So, I was hoping that under mission-led government, there might be an opportunity there to think a bit differently, think a bit more collaboratively across government, to be able to account for these things in a different way. So who knows? I haven't seen any change as yet, but perhaps it's a tall ask. But I think, that's something that I would really want to see.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched briefly on your work within the civil service. I mean, you spent 18 years, I think, was it, in the civil service?
Good, yes.
You held some really senior strategic roles in the Department of Health and Social Care, and also worked in the Cabinet Office. And yeah, I'm not, obviously, as you say, not expecting you to have the answers to this, but
Mhm.
really interesting. I mean, it's really why I wanted to get you on, Penelope, because just that kind of insight from having worked both inside and outside of government, just really understanding a little bit more about, what you think those barriers are to central government, really taking decisive action in relation to supported housing. 'Cause it feels like we've just been through, oh, gosh, a decade really of kind of, there's been noises, but actually
Yeah.
very little kind of concrete change has come out around this agenda. And yet, as you say, there's, supported housing is effectively in crisis, as the National Housing Federation is campaigning at the moment. And yet there is so much kind of potential there, so much needed potential to hit just the parts of our systems that we know are under so much pressure. And
Mm.
why is it so difficult to get that kind of cross directorate kind of commitment or collaboration. What from based on your experience of working in there, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it is, that profile and understanding, as I say, and I think the way that government is set up, not and it's not set up to work collaboratively. There is collaborative working, and senior officials will be working on supported housing. There was, when I was in government, a board with MHCLG, DWP, given the housing benefit and the benefit link, and DHSC, and working together on supported housing policy, and that is brilliant. Just the sheer reality of it is, unfortunately, is political profile. And supported housing, as I say, when you're in it, you get it, and that's fab. But up against the challenges that MHCLG at the moment, absolute focus on 1.5 million houses in this parliament, which is brilliant and absolutely has a broader, more strategic input to supported housing. It is tangential and it will impact, and it's not at all to say that I would want it to be a lower priority than supported housing. But supported housing needs to be part of that. And so I think in terms of sort of the role of the NHF as they are doing, and they're campaigning at the moment to raise the profile of the challenges of the sector is really helpful. But we need to sort of ally, attach supported housing to some of these political priorities that have airtime, they have political attention, they have ministerial attention, because at the end of the day, if you don't have a minister driving something, you, as an official, you'll get a really struggle to get any change through. So I think if we can think through how we can contribute, supported housing is a contributor to, for example, the housing push. Supporting the housing needs to be part of that. On the NHS side, that's why I emphasise the work of the discharge services. If you think about what gets political time in DHSE, every winter there will be a massive push on delayed discharge, which is important both from a system perspective and an individual perspective. So we need to say that supported housing is part of solving that problem. Not solving it, you're not going to solve delayed discharge, but you could improve it massively. And actually, I think that is our route in terms of showing people how supported housing can contribute to some of these political priorities and give it some airtime, as I say, and attention. But then there's this whole broad, it's like an iceberg. Those would be the tip of the iceberg. And then underneath is this whole sector, this whole diverse and vibrant sector that in and of itself deserves attention, but we just have to accept that the political reality is that there's only so much bandwidth. So how do we capitalise on that, really? And then collaborative working across government, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, so we describe, I'm sure everyone feels like this at a point in their careers, but it's the hamster wheel business and the hamster wheel of working in government. It's frantic, and there's a lot of people working incredibly hard and doing some really productive things, but there is also, in my experience, there is also a lot of activity which feels frantic and very important, but actually it crowds out, a lot of that activity crowds out any innovative thinking and working with the sector to do something different. So, you've not seen any real partnership outreach working with the sector, I would say, on supported housing in my time where I've been conscious of it. And I just think that's such a shame that gets crowded out by everyday activity. So I'd really, we were speaking earlier about working independently and that privilege that comes with working for yourself, that you're in charge of your own time to a degree, and you can choose to spend time on something that is interesting, and it may not work, but exploring partnership conversations and thinking about novel ways of working. And just, I did not find that I had time to do that in government, which is such a shame. But yeah.
That's really interesting. And of course, there's such a, I mean, obviously there are people, I mean, you yourself was one of them. And thinking about Daryl Smith at MHCLG,
Yeah,
used to be,
absolutely.
there are some very long-standing civil servants who, really kind of understand this agenda really
Absolutely.
well. But I guess what we've seen in recent years is a deliberate kind of, quite a strategic kind of churn of people through different
Yeah.
departmental posts. So there's really high turnover. I've done projects for government where we've had, half a dozen different people leading
Yes.
leading at different points. So, when I was just in a podcast the other day with Andrew Redfern, and we were reflecting on the sort of lack of organizational memory, I guess. You have an initiative that works really well and then it goes,
Mm.
and we're like, why don't we go back and do it again? Or you have something that doesn't work very well and we start trying to reinvent the wheel. And I can just, I guess that kind of, one of the downsides of that churn, both in terms of civil servants and in terms, of course, of ministers. I mean, we've seen that
Mm.
very acutely over the
Absolutely.
last year or so in the housing and homelessness department. But,
Mm.
it just means that there literally isn't that organisational memory, is there?
No, and I think that's true. A huge advantage in a lot of ways of working for government was, from a personal point of view, your ability to go to very different policy areas across government. You can move quite widely, quite regularly. So, from a personal point of view, that can be really appealing. From an institutional point of view, and how you keep and value, you could get me talking for ages about how the civil service may or may not value its staff and succession plan, and think about the value of the skills and expertise and knowledge and sectoral knowledge that you hold in your staff, and how it is best to reward that and to make sure that you retain it. I'm not sure it is done well, and there's a real risk there. So then it comes down to your ability as a sector to support and bring people up to speed, and to hold that institutional memory in the sector instead. But then again, that relies on an outward focused government function, which absolutely I have such respect for public servants. I have, it was a real privilege to work at the centre of government, and there's really bright, motivated, values-based people in government trying to do the right thing. I have my utmost respect for all the people who are still there trying to do the right thing. But it's you've got to have people who are willing and able and have the time and space to be able to work externally and to build those relationships with the sector, and that really matters. So, yeah.
And I think, you alluded earlier to the complexity of supported housing, and that's something which I think is a real barrier, sort of trying to tangle your way through all of that. I mean, gosh, I've been working in the supported housing space, in a sort of research and evaluative capacity for
Mm.
well over a decade. And I still, every time I go into like the housing benefit regulations, for
Oh
instance,
gosh.
I feel like, oh gosh, I have to read them all over
Yes.
again. And there's other layers of complexity that hadn't quite dawned on me. Even
Yeah.
when you are immersed in this area, it is deeply complicated, isn't it? The kind of funding and the sort of technical aspects of it. Yet, as recent legislation has highlighted, we don't really have any form of kind of regulation. It's a very unusual kind of
Mm.
industry, isn't it? And I just wonder. I mean, we'll spare readers kind of, we won't go through all of that
Oh,
complexity.
I'm glad.
Enough to make anybody turn off,
Put
but
me on the spot.
yeah, yeah. But I'm just wondering, I mean, I'm mindful that in your excellent report on scaling up capital, for example, which I will put a link to in the below, um, there were a few kind of quite distinct asks of government that you made there in
Mm.
relation to some of that. I mean, although on the one hand, it does feel like where do we even begin to sort of unpick some of that complexity? It does feel like there are one or two kind of very clear asks that fell out of that report that you just think, actually, if you're going to do one thing, just do this. Do you want to say a
Right.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And yes, I do. My ability to research and focus on, exactly as you say, diving through the regulations, which I would never have had time to do in government. And there are, I mean, you mentioned Daryl earlier. He understands the system as best as anyone, I think,
Yeah.
and thank goodness he does. It is hugely complicated. The asks that we came up from for government in particular, there is the need to sustainably fund the system. So how you do that, I have views, but the government should decide how, if we value the system, and I've spoken about some of the impact the sector has, so how do you make sure that there is money available so that you don't have providers who are withdrawing as they are at a vast rate, because it is not sustainable. So supported housing is more expensive to run than general needs for various reasons. So the needs of the people that are supported in supported housing are varied, and it massively depends. So if you're looking at mental health supported housing, the level of adaptation would be quite low, actually. However, the sort of the needs of the people who are being met in supported housing may have behaviours that mean your maintenance costs are higher, your voids costs, because you've got quite a high turnover of people as they come and go, because their mental health has improved, and hopefully, that level of voids is expensive. So because people are not in your unit, and therefore you can't money from them because they're not paying their rent. So those costs are unavoidable. So are we demonstrating to government the level of costs that needs to be met? And if we are, how can they be met? So whether that's through the benefit system, whether that's through your care and support contract, whatever, the money needs to be there, because it is a cost that is real to providers. So I think the sustainable funding is really important. Sorry, I've completely forgotten
we were just
sorry,
talking about your specific asks from the
asks. Thank you. So yes, the funding. Then very specifically, the way in which supported housing can be funded and housing benefits. At the moment, there is an allowance for a 10% higher rate than local housing allowance for rent for supported housing, but that doesn't cover these increased costs. That's not sufficient. So National Housing Federation is asking for at least 20%. And I think that is absolutely needed to be able to meet some of those costs. I would like, coming from DHSC, there's a huge opportunity in neighbourhood health, and perhaps we can come on to that. But the DHSC does not give enough profile and attention to housing, given the impact that poor housing, so poor quality housing, damp, mould, whatever, but also the stress and the impact on someone's health of having insecure housing has a huge impact on mental health in particular, but also physical health. So it is hugely important. It is a primary determinant of your health outcomes is your housing. So DHSC, in my view, should be speaking about housing in every sense. Any decision about care should be one about housing. We need to make a reality of that. So as they start to think about how neighbourhood health services are structured and formed, housing needs to be in there. It doesn't need to be in the sort of VCSE bucket, which it is. We are part of the VCSE in obvious terms, but in my view, it supersedes that, and it is of primary importance and should be sort of specifically mentioned and planned for and be part of those conversations. And so I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, we've been there before, haven't we? I mean, when this sort of whole integrated care kind of boards and partnerships approach came about, again, housing was really jostling to get a seat around the table. I mean, partly because, of course, you often have multiple providers in an area and it's quite difficult. Obviously there have been examples up and down the country where providers have kind of got together and formed a kind of place-based partnership, and that's obviously really helped. But you're right, there was very little recognition of housing's very different status through its kind of being a landlord and what that meant and the kind of capital ramifications of that. And let's hope we don't kind of replicate that in the way in which we design these new structures. I guess a couple of things that just kind of occurred to me as you were talking, Penelope. I mean, one thing which I think is particularly interesting and perhaps also quite challenging for mental health supported housing is the sort of scale on which it operates. I mean, I've done quite a lot of work in the older people's housing care and support sector, and there where we're bringing online new sort of extra care housing schemes. We might be looking these days at a kind of 80 units perhaps in a scheme, certainly no fewer than 50. Yet where as a mental health scheme, you probably don't want to be looking at, well, certainly nothing like that kind of size.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the sort of diversity
Yeah.
range of size and how that impacts really on trying to get the model to stack up?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. So I think sort of it depends what you're talking about in terms of customer group, but specifically for mental health services, you're looking at about 10 units ideally. Certainly no more really than 16, 20. It becomes an institution, which is what you're trying to avoid. So what you're trying to support is people to move into the community and to live independently. And as soon as you get sort of beyond, yeah, let's say 12 units as a ballpark, that is manageable. It's manageable from a point of view of scale for the staffing rota. Again, depending on the level of needs that you're meeting in that service, you can have perhaps a 9 to 5 staff rota. That would absolutely be at the lower end of support needs, up to what we call double cover. So you've got 2 members of staff on 24/7. And obviously that level of staffing is obviously more expensive. But in terms of being able to support that across the number of units and thinking about how many staff you need per resident, that's 12 units is around your happy place from a scale point of view. And I think the difference in terms of, so homelessness service would be potentially bigger than that, and we're moving away from those huge hostel style supported services, but certainly historically there have been larger numbers at that point. But the impact this has on how you account for a service and pay for a service, obviously in terms of your maintenance and your voids, you need to be able to make sure that your contract, your care and support contract, and the revenue you're able to generate on the rent side as well can add up and meet your costs. So from the NHS perspective, we've been able to make an argument that it's worth investing in supported housing because your cost comparison point is of staffing a hospital ward, and the level of staffing and the clinical staff that you would have on a hospital ward drives the cost of that ward up. The cost, therefore, of supporting somebody outside of hospital with our support staff can be better value for money. A point I want to raise that I should have raised under when you asked me about the change that I'd be looking for is about the profile of support staff and the professionalism of our staff. I've had the privilege to spend time out with our staff in our services, and I'm absolutely in awe of these people. They work so hard to support people. They are sort of absolutely values driven, and the person-centered support, we talk about it a lot in policy terms, and I think you could rattle up sort of in policy terms, in the language, how you would want a service to be designed. But seeing it delivered is so powerful. And I think the level of complexity that can be supported safely in the community is quite amazing. And I think something else, another part of my professional life, I work with HACT, so the Housing Association for Charitable Trust. And I work in a health and housing team, and we go out to different areas and look at how we can better integrate housing into usually mental health, learning disability and autism pathways. And it's been really interesting the work that I've been doing with HACT. When we go out and we speak to people working in hospitals, local authorities, housing providers, and we speak across the spectrum, what you often observe is there is a sort of cultural difference, a massive cultural difference between the world of the NHS and the world of housing providers, care and support. And there is a huge sort of myth-busting bit that we need to do with clinical staff in particular, but NHS more broadly, about the professionalism and the skills and the capability of supported housing and the providers. Our support staff, if I think back to our service called Oaklands and St Kilda's, so this is the young people service, that supports young people in mental health crisis. So this is at our higher end, and it's a double cover unit. So we always have 2 members of staff at any one time. And can I just divert to a sort of personal story reflecting like a case
Yeah.
study there,
Yeah.
which you would have heard before. But the level of risk, the level of need and complexity, we'll come back to risk, is quite profound. So if I give an example of somebody who's supported in Oaklands, and when I spent time there, I spent time with our service manager called Mario, and he is excellent. And he told me about a young lady who he'd been to visit. She was a referral to the service. And the first time he went to visit her in her previous home, she hadn't left the building for 6 months at all. And she would under the duvet and didn't engage with Mario at all. So he's very good at his job and very perceptive. So he persevered. And by the 4th visit to her, she had opened up enough that he felt comfortable to take this young lady into Oaklands as a customer and to support her. And so her needs at that point, it took her a month, but she was going outside of the building within a month of staying at Oaklands. And within 2 months, she was going on day trips. She'd been to the zoo and she'd signed up for weekly tutoring. She was back on her medication. She was back engaging with other public services, her clinical team. And the professionalism and the skills of the support team, the support workers at Oaklands, I just think the difference that has made to that young lady, who is now participating in community life, and she can see a way forward to her future, I hope, and she's engaged with her recovery. That's huge, and that's so important for her, but it's so important for wider services. If she's not engaged, you see a spiral, a horrible spiral, and a repeated series of crises, which is expensive for the system. If we're going to be crude and reductive about it, it's expensive for the system, but it's poor in terms of outcomes. And these are not clinical staff in Oaklands. It's absolutely in partnership with a clinical team, and we ensure that we always have that clinical support within our services. But we need to convey to the NHS, we need to sort of more broadly assure people that the risk can be managed out in the community, and actually the safest place for somebody might not be the best place. And I've seen this through my work with HACT, trying to have these conversations, and quite often no reason why an NHS clinician will have spent time in the mental health supported service. Many absolutely get it, and that's amazing, but many won't have done. And why would they? But we need to use experts such as HACT, but there are others out who can bridge those worlds of health and housing and demonstrate that actually there's such opportunity through integration and through supporting people and meeting their needs in the best place for them. And quite often that can be somewhere like our supported services.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you, raised that point about workforce, because of course it's partly you need the capital and the
Yes.
revenue to be able to secure that capital, but absolutely the success of these services, is very, very largely due to the caliber of staff, isn't it? And of course, it takes resource, in the widest sense of the word, I guess, to kind of deliver that service in a sustainable and safe way. And that's partly about worker pay and,
Absolutely.
kind of conditions and the contractual offer that we can make to workers. And obviously there's been quite a lot of focus on that. But as you rightly point out, it's also so much about that kind of clinical support and the support of wider systems. And we've heard so much feedback where that hasn't been in place, where providers have just ended up kind of left, really. There's
Yeah.
a sort of sense that, like, well, these people are better off than perhaps somebody who isn't in a supported housing scheme, because at least they've got the support staff. Therefore, as clinical or social work staff, we can somehow
Yeah.
deprioritize. But actually, that's such a short-sighted view, isn't it? And if
Mm.
you can build those partnerships at that operational level, which really recognize what each of those kind of partners is really bringing to the care and
Exactly.
support of that individual, both in terms of attitude to risk and that kind of very, incredibly painstakingly dedicated, strength-based kind of
Mm,
work that it takes to enable somebody to kind of take progressively more positive risks in their lives. And I
yeah.
think really kind of spelling out that that's needed at an operational level if we're going to scale up this kind of way of working is as important in some ways as getting the funding in, isn't it? I think.
Absolutely. And actually, just on that point, I think, and perhaps we'll come to it, but in terms of how you do this, so how do you make that change within a system to understand the role of the different partners? You know, you will have absolutely spent time with them, but in Sussex, they've made a huge change, and this it was part of their hacked work to develop a mental health and housing strategy. So at a strategic level to plan for housing in your mental health pathway. It is so important. And you've spoken about it. People come into hospital, and if there's no communication or integration with housing providers, people lose their tenancy. I've spoken to providers who are blissfully unaware, unfortunately, that their tenants are in hospital because nobody's told them. And so when they come to collect the rent, they're not there. So they are forced to suspend the tenancy. So people become homeless in hospital. This is a balmy situation. It's bad for everybody because then the hospital finds that there's nowhere to discharge them to. And it's just how do you try to bridge this gap? So with the work with Hacked, they have quite a well-established sort of series of steps that can be taken to make this better. But in Sussex, they've appointed a housing director in the hospital. So there is a housing team of housing specialists in the hospital. And I think bringing that housing expertise in, housing is massively complicated. I don't claim to understand the whole of it at all. I'm very, very aware that I'm scraping the surface of my housing knowledge. And you've spoken about the local authority structure. So that's about to change. But at the moment, you have a two-tier authority. And so you've got housing. You might have 5 to 10 housing authorities in one social care commissioning area, let alone the sort of footprint of your hospital ICB commissioning area. It is complicated.
Different. It's messy as heck, isn't it?
And when you're busy doing a clinical job and there's somebody in front of you who needs your attention, I completely get that the thought of trying to navigate this housing sort of setup must be absolutely baffling. So let's make that easier for people and let's bring that expertise in. So it will vary depending on your setup locally as to what's best, but bringing those housing specialists into your trust enables you to sort of interweave housing throughout your processes. So you've got an admission process that says, what's your housing situation? So if there is a problem with your housing at the point you are admitted, it can be being supported throughout your time in hospital, and you're ready for support at discharge. And it needs to be part of your planning for discharge, is obviously where you're going to go. So, it can be done, and it has been done. And in Sussex, the evidence is brilliant. So from sort of housing delays that were responsible for 40% of their discharge delays, that's now down to less than 5, consistently less than 5%. And when you think about this, the cost impact, the personal outcomes, the flow of the system, it's huge. So we know how to do this stuff well. There are experts. Hacked is one example, but there are people out there and systems out there who are doing it well. So it's back to that point: how do you scale it? How do you replicate it? And how do you give places the space to innovate and make decisions about their own systems and what would work best for them?
Absolutely, that kind of sense. I mean, we've heard, in the conversation, that at so many levels, that kind of partnership way of thinking, whether it's, operationally around an individual's care and support, whether it's at that kind of place-based level, whether it's thinking about our kind of pathways through health systems, whether it's thinking about that kind of, macro level, strategic cross directorate thinking. Yeah, it's sort of, it needs to happen at all those different
All
layers,
levels.
doesn't it? And you've given us a really clear roadmap as to where that looks. And yeah, we're just, obviously everybody's firefighting, and you just hear these instances of, crazily inefficient and, poor outcomes for
Yeah,
individual spending. You've got kind of community mental health teams trying to support people who've just been discharged into a B&B, and you
yeah,
just think, oh,
absolutely.
high levels of spending for local authorities or for health with often really kind of poor outcomes for
Mm.
individuals. So, we do need to kind of boldly pull back from some of this kind of reactive spending and think about how we can be more progressive. And I'm going to just kind of to sort of bring us to a close, I guess, come back to this neighbourhood health
Yeah,
opportunity, I guess, because we've
opportunity.
obviously just had the announcement in the last couple of weeks of the pilots for neighbourhood health services. So that's the kind of where we're all there's all sorts of workshops and kind of events going on at the moment, just trying to kind of make sense of what this is going to look like and start to really kind of put this into practice. And I'm just wondering, we heard right from your example at the very start, a really practical way in which a supported housing provider like yourselves can be really kind of positively involved
Mm.
in a neighbourhood health initiative. I'm just wondering whether at that kind of national level, whether you feel this kind of step can really kind of create new opportunities for better integration between health and care and housing, and sort of, if so, what we need really to make that happen, to realise that vision.
Yeah, so I think it's a huge opportunity. We've been here before though, and we need to make sure that we've been talking about integration for decades, and a lot of commentators have made the point that we've been talking about it for decades. So how do you actually make that shift? Well, I think there's no sort of single prescribed way of doing it, but I do think at two levels you need to make sure that housing is interwoven within these neighbourhood health services as they are planned and set up. You don't need to tag it on afterwards. Let's do it from the beginning, and it needs to be both at a governance level. So the conversations about commissioning, the conversations about money, the conversations about your strategic partnerships, housing must be represented at that level. It needs to be in the room when you are having these conversations. If you have a purely NHS body, and this, I'm sure there's any number of ICB setups, but typically my understanding was that primarily they were health. There was statutory requirements as to who you needed in the room. So there would be a local authority board, or there would be somebody from the BCSE. But that's sort of integrating on paper. To integrate really is developing those relationships, giving equal voice and respect and value to the different points of view that you have around the room. So, and I believe that housing needs to be part of that, because it has such a huge impact on services. We all know how important our home is. If you have a home, if you do not have a home, it is hugely important because it will dominate your existence. And so we need to have that as part of those decision-making conversations. And then sort of operationally, we don't really know what these neighbourhood health providers will look like, and it will vary. And that's the whole point of the 43, is sort of setting up what works for each of these different places. And there will be any number of ways that you could make this work from a housing perspective, but you need them in the room. So just as I spoke about Sussex, I think both within primary and in secondary care, you need somebody there who can navigate your housing system. So that is both understanding and linking in, whether it's a local authority officer, or they are able to link into the local authority to access sort of your statutory housing services, and they need a really good understanding and links into your housing providers. So however you want to do that, within primary care, as somebody rocks up in the GP surgery and actually there's sort of various sort of vague symptoms, but actually there's a real problem with their housing. Well, what does the GP do? They might be able to do something for the respiratory symptoms that are coming from mold or damp. Wouldn't it be better if they were able to properly access that housing support to address the root cause? And equally in the hospital, as I've described, if we have housing as part of the multidisciplinary team, so alongside your social workers, your occupational therapists, there's so many parts of people and people's needs, and housing needs to be up there. So however you do it, my view is that you need housing both at a governance and an operational level. And what the government could be doing, and DHSE teams could be doing, is ensuring that in the guidance, whenever you talk about health and care, you talk about housing. And it doesn't cost anything to do that. It is part of making people think of housing as a matter of course, rather than thinking of it as not an irrelevance, but something that is outside their wheelhouse. And yes, you may not have a statutory responsibility for housing as a GP, but it would massively make your job easier if you were able to access proper housing support, and navigate that system.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a really really clear vision there of a very different relationship with the housing sector, isn't there? I think for too long there's been an assumption that landlords will just bring the buildings along.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or that we can, that we can kind of procure, often at the lowest cost, housing support, and actually, I think, that we've ended up in a situation where housing isn't sort of part of that place-based strategic conversation. Yet your examples from Look Ahead have shown just what's possible when they are. And I really like, over the course of the conversation, the kind of, I guess that kind of advice to those housing providers is both at that very sort of local place-based level and at the sort of national level, is really look for the kind of key priorities and find out how you can then hook your offer into that, and create space for that very sort of collaborate problem-solving approach, to the really sort of huge issues that we're facing at that interface between health and housing. So thank you so much for coming on, Penelope. It's been
Very
really,
welcome.
really interesting, rich conversation. I really appreciate that, and good luck with all of your influencing and evaluation work.
Thank you so much for having me, Imogen. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.